Marcus Thompson cleaned courthouse floors for $8 an hour, working 2 jobs to afford his daughter's heart medication. When a grieving widower pulled a gun on the billionaire CEO who made that medicine, Marcus had 1 second to choose: save the man he hated, or let Emma lose her hero forever. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished his night shift at the courthouse. At 35, his hands were already rough from years of janitorial work, calloused from scrubbing floors until they gleamed, from lifting heavy trash bags and pushing worn-out equipment. But despite the weariness that seemed permanently etched into his face, his eyes still held the gentle warmth that made his 8-year-old daughter Emma smile every morning. The courthouse was silent at 3 a.m., its marble floors reflecting the dim security lights. Marcus had been cleaning these halls for 4 years now, ever since he'd lost his construction job when Emma got sick. The pay was barely enough, but it had health insurance, limited coverage that still left them drowning in medical debt, but something was better than nothing. "Daddy, will you be home for breakfast tomorrow?" Emma had asked the night before, her small fingers clutching her worn teddy bear, the same one she'd held during those terrifying nights in the hospital. "I'll try, sweetheart," Marcus had whispered, kissing her forehead and smoothing down her dark hair that looked so much like her mother's. "Daddy has to work extra hours this week." The truth was harder to admit, too heavy for an 8-year-old's shoulders. Marcus worked 2 jobs, cleaning the courthouse from midnight to 6 a.m., then rushing home to get Emma ready for school, grabbing 2 hours of sleep, and then stocking shelves at Peterson's grocery from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Even then, the medical bills from Emma's heart surgery 2 years ago were drowning them in debt that seemed to grow faster than he could pay it down. Emma's cardiologist had been clear: "She'll need this medication for the rest of her life, Mr. Thompson. Without it, her heart could fail." The medication cost $400 a month. Their rent was $600. Food, utilities, gas for his 15-year-old Honda. It all added up to more than he made, even working 16 hours a day. His wife Sarah had left when the bills started piling up and the stress became too much. "I can't handle this stress, Marcus," she'd said, packing her bags while Emma slept in the hospital bed, recovering from her second surgery. "I married you for better or worse, but this isn't worse. This is impossible. Find me when you get your life together." That was 3 years ago. Marcus never looked for her. Some nights, when Emma asked why mommy didn't come back, Marcus would hold her close and say, "Sometimes people get scared, baby. But I'm never leaving you." The courthouse held too many memories for Marcus. He'd walked these same halls 5 years ago, filing for bankruptcy after Emma's first surgery. He'd sat in Courtroom C when his lawyer had explained that medical debt couldn't be discharged, that he'd be paying these bills for the rest of his life. Judge Patricia Morrison had looked down at him with what he'd thought was pity, but now he wondered if it had been understanding. Every night as he mopped these floors, Marcus saw ghosts of his former life. He'd once been proud, a union construction worker, homeowner, husband. Now he was invisible, the man who cleaned up after other people's important lives while his own fell apart piece by piece. But Emma kept him going. Her laugh when he made silly faces during breakfast, her pride when she showed him her A+ spelling tests, the way she'd curl up next to him on their second-hand couch and tell him about her dreams of becoming a doctor, "so I can help sick kids like me." She was his reason for everything, his reminder that some things were worth any sacrifice. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with that bone-chilling dampness that seemed to seep through the courthouse's old stone walls. Marcus had just finished mopping the courthouse floors, his back aching from hours of bending and scrubbing, when he heard shouting from the main courtroom. His shift was technically over. He should have been heading home to wake Emma, make her breakfast, and try to catch a few hours of sleep before his afternoon shift at Peterson's. But something in the voices made him pause. There was a desperation there, a raw pain that he recognized from his own sleepless nights when Emma's medical bills arrived in the mail. Through the slightly open courtroom doors, he could see a high-profile trial in session. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers in expensive suits, and families who looked like they'd been carrying the weight of the world for too long. Marcus had been reading about this case in the newspapers he found in the courthouse trash. When you're too broke to buy a paper, you learn to catch up on news wherever you can find it. Richard Wellington, the CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals, was being sued by dozens of families who claimed his company's new arthritis drug had caused severe heart problems, liver damage, and in some cases, death. The families looked exactly like Marcus felt most days: desperate, exhausted, fighting a system that seemed designed to crush people like them. Wellington sat confident and smug at the defendant's table, surrounded by a team of lawyers that probably cost more per hour than Marcus made in a month. Marcus had read about him in those discarded newspapers. A billionaire who lived in 3 mansions and owned a yacht bigger than most people's houses, all while families like Marcus's struggled to afford the life-saving medications his company manufactured at enormous profit margins. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Emma's heart medication was made by a subsidiary of Wellington's company. Every month, $400 of Marcus's hard-earned money went straight into this man's empire, money that meant Marcus and Emma ate rice and beans most nights, that meant Marcus's shoes had holes he covered with duct tape, that meant Emma wore clothes from the church donation box. In the gallery, Marcus could see the plaintiffs, mothers who'd lost children, elderly people in wheelchairs, men who looked like they'd aged a decade in the past year. Their faces told stories Marcus knew too well: the crushing weight of medical bills, the helplessness of watching loved ones suffer while corporations counted profits. The lead plaintiff attorney was speaking passionately about corporate responsibility, about how Wellington's company had rushed their drug to market without adequate testing, about internal emails that showed executives knew about potential side effects but chose to hide them to protect their stock price. Wellington's lawyers responded with cold statistics and legal technicalities, arguing that correlation didn't prove causation, that these families couldn't definitively prove the medication had caused their loved ones problems. They spoke about these human tragedies like they were discussing quarterly earnings reports. Suddenly, Marcus noticed one man in the gallery who looked different from the rest. David Chin sat rigid in the third row, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Marcus recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror during the darkest days after Sarah left, when the bills kept coming and Emma kept asking why Daddy looked so sad. David's wife Lisa had been featured in one of the newspaper articles Marcus had read. She'd been a healthy 34-year-old teacher when she started taking Wellington's arthritis medication for joint pain from an old sports injury. 3 months later, she was dead from sudden cardiac arrest. The autopsy showed her heart was damaged in a way consistent with the drug's side effects, but Wellington's company maintained there was no proven connection. Now David sat alone in that courtroom, listening to lawyers debate whether his wife's death was worth compensating, watching Wellington check his expensive watch like this was just another inconvenience in his billionaire schedule. As Marcus watched through the crack in the door, he saw David Chen's composure finally shatter. The man who had sat quietly through 3 days of testimony, listening to lawyers argue about his wife's life like it was a budget line item, suddenly stood up. "You killed my wife," David screamed, his voice breaking with months of suppressed grief and rage. "You knew. The emails prove you knew people were dying and you didn't care." The courtroom fell silent except for David's ragged breathing. Everyone turned to stare at him, the grieving widower who'd lost everything to corporate greed. Marcus saw David's hand move to his jacket, and something cold settled in his stomach. In that split second, Marcus understood what was about to happen. He'd felt that same rage, that same desperate fury at a system that seemed designed to crush people like them. How many nights had he lain awake, wondering if it would be easier to just give up? How many times had he looked at Emma's medical bills and felt that surge of helpless anger at the people who profited from his daughter's illness? The glint of metal confirmed Marcus's worst fears. David had pulled a gun from inside his jacket, his hands shaking with fury and pain. "You sit there in your $1,000 suit talking about market forces and acceptable risks," David continued, his voice getting higher, more desperate. "Lisa was a person, not a risk assessment. She was going to be a mother. We were trying to have a baby." Wellington's security team was too far away, positioned near the back of the courtroom. The bailiff was reaching for his weapon, but he was on the wrong side of the room. Judge Morrison was reaching for her panic button, but it would take precious seconds for help to arrive. David raised the weapon, and Marcus saw something break in the man's eyes, the last thread of sanity snapping under the weight of grief and injustice. "She died scared and alone while you counted your money," David shouted. "How does it feel to know you're going to die the same way?" Time slowed down to a crawl. Marcus saw Wellington's face change from smug confidence to genuine terror. He saw the other families in the gallery diving for cover. He saw Judge Morrison's expression of horror as she realized what was happening in her courtroom. And in that frozen moment, Marcus made a choice that would change everything. Without thinking, without calculating the cost or weighing his options, Marcus burst through the courtroom doors. His worn work boots slipped slightly on the polished marble floor, but he kept running, driven by something deeper than thought. "No!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom as he sprinted toward David. "This isn't the way." The shot rang out just as Marcus threw himself between David and Wellington. The bullet, meant for the CEO's chest, tore through Marcus's shoulder instead. The impact spun him around and sent him crashing into the defendant's table, blood spreading across his faded blue janitor's uniform. The courtroom erupted in chaos. David stared at the gun in his hands, horrified by what he'd done. The weapon clattered to the floor as the full weight of his actions hit him. "Oh God," he whispered, falling to his knees. "Oh God, what did I do? I didn't mean. I just wanted him to understand." Security officers swarmed the scene while paramedics rushed in. Judge Morrison was shouting orders, her usual composed demeanor shattered by the violence in her courtroom. Wellington knelt beside Marcus as the paramedics worked frantically to stop the bleeding. The CEO's expensive suit was now stained with the blood of a man he'd never met, a man who had just saved his life. "Why?" Wellington asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you save me? You don't even know me." Marcus's vision was blurring, the pain in his shoulder a white-hot agony that made it hard to think. But through the haze he could see Emma's face in his mind, her trusting smile, her innocent belief that her daddy was a hero just because he tucked her in at night and made her breakfast in the morning. "Because," Marcus managed, his voice weak but determined, "because my daughter needs me to be someone she can be proud of. And because your life matters too, even if you've forgotten that other people's lives matter just as much." As the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, Marcus caught David's eyes across the courtroom. The man was being handcuffed, tears streaming down his face as he realized what his grief and anger had led him to do. "I'm sorry," David mouthed, his voice lost in the chaos but his meaning clear. Marcus nodded weakly before the world went black. Marcus woke up in the hospital 2 days later, his mind foggy from painkillers and trauma. The first thing he saw was Emma's face, streaked with tears, her small hand clutching his uninjured one like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Daddy," she cried when she saw his eyes open, her voice breaking with relief and fear. "I was so scared. Mrs. Rodriguez said you were hurt bad and the TV people were saying." "I'm okay, baby," Marcus whispered, though speaking hurt more than he expected. His throat was dry, his shoulder felt like it was on fire, and every small movement sent waves of pain through his body. "Daddy's okay now." Emma climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of the tubes and wires connected to her father. "The doctor said you were brave, Daddy. They said you saved someone's life." Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who had been watching Emma, sat in the corner chair looking exhausted. She was in her 70s, surviving on Social Security, but she'd dropped everything to take care of Emma when the hospital called. "Mijo," she said softly, using the Spanish endearment she'd called him since Emma was born, "the whole city's talking about you. You're all over the news, heroic janitor saves CEO's life. The reporters have been calling non-stop." But Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who couldn't afford to be in this hospital, whose daughter might lose her father because he'd acted without thinking about the consequences. The private room, the machines monitoring his vital signs, the team of specialists who'd operated on his shoulder. None of this was covered by his basic courthouse insurance. Dr. Sarah Martinez entered the room with a thick file and a concerned expression. She was young, probably around Marcus's age, with kind eyes that reminded him of Emma's pediatric cardiologist. "Mr. Thompson, I'm glad you're awake," she said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "I need to discuss your condition and your treatment plan." Marcus's heart sank. Treatment plan meant money they didn't have. "The bullet damaged several nerves in your shoulder and nicked an artery," Dr. Martinez continued. "We've repaired the immediate damage, but you're going to need extensive physical therapy for months, possibly additional surgery to fully restore function. And I'm afraid you won't be able to do heavy physical work for quite some time." The words hit Marcus like a second bullet. No work meant no income from either of his jobs. The courthouse wouldn't hold his position indefinitely, and Peterson's grocery had already told Mrs. Rodriguez they needed to know if he'd be back within 2 weeks. Emma looked between the doctor and her father, her 8-year-old mind trying to process what she was hearing. "Daddy, does this mean you can't work? Are we going to be okay?" Marcus forced a smile for his daughter's sake. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. We always do." But privately, Marcus was calculating disaster. His savings account had exactly $247 in it. His rent was due in 12 days. Emma's heart medication couldn't be delayed. Without his income, they'd be homeless within a month. As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that the hospital has received several calls about your situation. There are people who want to help." "I don't want charity," Marcus said immediately, the pride that had gotten him through years of struggle flaring up despite his vulnerable position. Sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing you can do, Dr. Martinez replied gently. Especially when you have someone depending on you. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep curled up beside him, Marcus stared at the ceiling and wondered how he'd gotten to this point. 3 days ago he'd been barely managing but surviving. Now he was facing medical bills that would bankruptcy him all over again, unemployment, and the very real possibility that he wouldn't be able to provide for Emma. The worst part was the guilt. He'd acted on instinct, throwing himself in front of that bullet without thinking about what would happen to Emma if he died or became disabled. What kind of father put his daughter's security at risk for a stranger, even to save a life? But then he remembered Emma's words from earlier. The doctor said you were brave, Daddy. Maybe that was worth something. Maybe showing his daughter that some things were more important than money or security. Maybe that was a lesson worth the cost. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus expected another nurse, but instead he saw a familiar figure in the doorway, Richard Wellington, looking nothing like the confident CEO from the courtroom. The man appeared tired, shaken, and somehow smaller than he had behind the defendant's table. Mr. Thompson, Wellington said quietly, removing his expensive hat and holding it awkwardly in his hands. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to thank you personally. Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake. Marcus kept his voice low, not wanting to disturb her sleep. She'd barely left his side since he'd been admitted. You don't need to thank me, Marcus said, his tone colder than he'd intended. I just did what anyone would do. But that wasn't entirely true and they both knew it. Most people would have called for help or frozen in terror, or thought about their own safety first. Marcus had risked everything for a man he'd never spoken to, a man whose company had profited from his family's struggles. Wellington sat down in the visitor's chair, uninvited but somehow not unwelcome. Up close, without the expensive lawyers and corporate armor, he looked older than Marcus had expected. There were lines around his eyes, gray in his hair, and something in his expression that hadn't been there in the courtroom. I know about your situation, Wellington said quietly. The medical bills, working 2 jobs, raising Emma alone. I had my people do some research. Marcus's anger flared, despite his weakened state. You had no right. I had every right, Wellington interrupted, but not unkindly. A man saved my life. I wanted to understand what kind of man does that. He paused, looking at Emma's sleeping form. Especially when that man has every reason to hate people like me. What do you mean? Wellington pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. Your daughter's heart medication, Cardioplex. My company manufactures it. The same company those families are suing. You've been paying full price for it for 2 years, haven't you? $400 a month. Marcus's jaw tightened. $400 that meant they ate rice and beans most nights, that meant Marcus wore shoes with holes in them, that meant Emma's winter coat came from the church donation box because they couldn't afford a new one. So what? Marcus asked bitterly. Are you here to raise the price? Wellington looked genuinely taken aback. No. I'm here because I've been thinking about something you said in that courtroom. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. You said my life mattered, but that I'd forgotten other people's lives matter just as much. You were right. Marcus studied the man who sat beside his hospital bed. This was Richard Wellington, CEO of a pharmaceutical empire worth billions, a man who could buy and sell Marcus's entire life 1,000 times over. Yet he sat there looking almost vulnerable, like he was searching for something he'd lost a long time ago. I've spent my entire career believing that business is just business, Wellington continued. That what happens in boardrooms and what happens in people's homes are separate things. That if people can't afford our medications, well, that's unfortunate but not our responsibility. He stood and walked to the window looking out at the city lights. But lying in that courtroom knowing I was about to die, I realized something. David Chin wasn't just some crazy man with a gun. He was a husband who watched his wife die because of decisions I made in air-conditioned boardrooms, decisions about profit margins and market share. Marcus remained silent, unsure where this was going but sensing something important happening. I have children too, Mr. Thompson, Wellington said, turning back from the window. A son and daughter, 12 and 10 years old. But they live with their mother in Switzerland. Do you know why? Marcus shook his head. Because I work 16 hours a day building an empire I thought would make them proud of me. I haven't seen them in 8 months because I've been too busy acquiring companies and maximizing shareholder value. Wellington's voice cracked slightly. I was building them a legacy but I forgot to build them a father. Emma stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about wanting pancakes for breakfast. Both men looked at her. This little girl who was the center of Marcus's entire universe, who got more love and attention from her minimum wage father than Wellington's children got from their billionaire dad. When you threw yourself in front of that bullet, Wellington continued, you weren't thinking about stock prices or quarterly earnings or risk assessments. You were thinking about being the kind of man your daughter could be proud of. That's something I forgot how to do years ago. Wellington sat back down and opened the folder he'd brought. I want to pay your medical bills, Mr. Thompson. All of them. Including Emma's. I don't want your charity, Marcus said immediately, the automatic response of a man who'd struggled to maintain his dignity through years of poverty. It's not charity, Wellington replied firmly. It's justice. I've made billions from medications that families like yours struggle to afford. That's not right, and for the first time in my life I want to do something about it. He pulled out a document from the folder. This is a proposal I'm presenting to my board next week. A patient assistance program that would provide free medications to any family making less than $60,000 a year. It would cost the company about $50 million annually. Marcus stared at the document, trying to process what he was hearing. $50 million? More money than he could comprehend, spent to help families like his own. Why? He asked simply. Wellington looked at Emma again, then back at Marcus. Because when my son calls me from Switzerland and asks why a janitor had to save his father's life, why his father couldn't save himself, I want to have an answer that makes him proud instead of ashamed. I've spent my whole career believing that business is just business, Wellington continued. That profits and people are separate things. But lying in that courtroom, knowing I was about to die, I realized something. He stood and walked to the window. I have children too, Mr. Thompson. A son and daughter about Emma's age. But they live with their mother in Switzerland. I haven't seen them in 8 months because I've been too busy making money. Marcus remained silent, unsure where this was going. When you threw yourself in front of that bullet, you weren't thinking about money or business or profit margins. You were thinking about being the kind of man your daughter could be proud of. That's something I forgot how to do years ago. Wellington turned back to Marcus. I want to pay your medical bills. All of them. Including Emma's. I don't want your charity, Marcus said immediately. It's not charity. It's justice. Wellington's voice was firm. I've made billions from medications that families like yours struggle to afford. That's not right, and for the first time in my life I want to do something about it. A week later, Marcus was well enough to leave the hospital. His arm was in a sling, but he was determined to return to work. When he arrived at the courthouse, however, he found something unexpected. Judge Patricia Morrison was waiting for him in the hallway. Mr. Thompson, she said, her usually stern face softening. I wanted to speak with you before the Wellington trial resumes. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I was just doing my job, Your Honor. No, Judge Morrison said firmly. You went far beyond your job. What you did in my courtroom showed more courage and character than I've seen in 20 years on the bench. She handed him an envelope. This is from the court administration. We're offering you a position as a court officer. Better pay, benefits, and your daughter can use the court's health insurance. Marcus stared at the envelope, hardly believing it. Why? Because this courthouse needs more people like you. People who do the right thing even when it's hard. When the Wellington trial resumed, the atmosphere was completely different. Wellington had fired his expensive lawyers and hired a single attorney. One known for working with families, not corporations. From his new position as court officer, Marcus watched as Wellington took the stand. I want to settle with every family represented here, Wellington announced to the shocked courtroom. Not because I legally have to, but because it's the right thing to do. The judge looked surprised. Mr. Wellington, you understand you're essentially admitting fault? I'm admitting something more important, Your Honor. I'm admitting that I lost sight of what matters. These families deserve compensation for their pain, and they deserve it now, not after years of legal battles. David Chin, the man who had tried to shoot Wellington, watched from the defendant's table where he was awaiting his own trial. Tears streamed down his face. After court that day, Marcus found Wellington waiting for him outside. I want to ask you something, Wellington said. I'm starting a foundation. A fund to help families afford the medications my company makes. I want you to help me run it. Marcus frowned. I'm not a businessman. I'm just a janitor, court officer now. Exactly. You understand what these families go through because you've lived it. I have the money, but you have something more valuable. You have heart. Marcus looked at this man he'd saved, this man he'd once hated. Why should I trust you? Wellington smiled sadly. Because yesterday I got a call from my children in Switzerland. They saw the news about what happened. My daughter asked me, "Daddy, why did a janitor have to save you? Why couldn't you save yourself?" He paused. I didn't have an answer. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a small office downtown. The sign on the door read, "The Emma Foundation, affordable medication for all." Inside, families waited to receive help with their prescription costs. Emma, now 9, helped organize paperwork after school. She was proud of her father in a way that made Marcus's heart full every day. Wellington had kept his word. Marcus's medical bills were gone, Emma's medication was free, and Marcus earned enough as the foundation's director to give his daughter the life she deserved. But more than that, something unexpected had happened. Marcus and Wellington had become friends. Not the friendship of equals, they still came from different worlds, but the friendship of two men who understood what really mattered. The biggest surprise came when David Chen was released from prison after serving only 6 months. His attempted murder charge had been reduced to assault, partly because of Wellington's testimony asking for leniency. Wellington had visited David in prison every week. "I don't forgive you for trying to kill me," Wellington had told him. "But I understand why you did it. And I want to help you channel that anger into something productive." David now worked at the Emma Foundation too, helping other families navigate the complex world of insurance and medication costs. His grief over his wife's death would never fully heal, but he'd found purpose in preventing other families from suffering the same way. 1 year after the shooting, Judge Morrison called Marcus into her chambers. "Mr. Thompson, I have an unusual request," she said. "The State Bar Association wants to honor you at their annual dinner. They're giving you an award for community service." Marcus felt uncomfortable. "Judge, I don't need any awards. I just did what anyone would do." "That's exactly why you deserve it," she replied. "Because you think what you did was normal when in fact, it was extraordinary." The night of the dinner, Marcus wore the first suit he'd ever owned, a gift from Wellington. Emma sat beside him in a beautiful dress, her eyes shining with pride. When Marcus's name was called, he walked to the podium with shaking hands. Looking out at the crowd of lawyers, judges, and politicians, he thought about how far he'd come. "I didn't save Mr. Wellington because I'm a hero," Marcus said into the microphone. "I saved him because my daughter taught me that we should help people when they need help, even if they're different from us." The crowd was silent. "A year ago I hated rich people. I thought they didn't care about families like mine. But I learned something important. People can change if you give them the chance. Mr. Wellington didn't have to help me, but he did. And because he changed, hundreds of families now get the medication they need." Marcus looked at Emma in the audience. "My daughter asks me every day, 'Daddy, how can I help people like you do?' And I tell her, 'Just remember that everyone is fighting a battle you don't know about. Be kind anyway.'" The Emma Foundation grew rapidly. Other pharmaceutical CEOs, shamed by the positive publicity Wellington received, started their own assistance programs. Congress passed new laws making prescription drugs more affordable. Marcus was invited to speak at medical schools and business schools across the country. But the biggest change was in the small moments. Emma, now confident and happy, started a kindness club at her school. Wellington began seeing his own children every month, then every week, then moved them back to the United States so he could be a real father. David Chen met a nurse at the foundation who had also lost her spouse to illness. Their grief brought them together and slowly they began to heal each other. Even Judge Morrison was affected. She started a program bringing successful people into schools to talk to children about making good choices, about how one moment of courage or kindness could change everything. On the second anniversary of the shooting, Marcus stood in the same courthouse where it had all begun. The families from the original lawsuit were there, but this time for a celebration. Wellington's foundation had helped over 10,000 families afford their medications. "I want to say something," Wellington announced to the gathered crowd. 2 years ago, a man I'd never met saved my life. But that's not the real story. The real story is that in saving my life, he saved my soul." Wellington looked at Marcus. "I was a man who thought money was everything. I was wrong. What matters is what Marcus showed me that day, that we're all connected, that we all have a responsibility to take care of each other." David Chen stood up. "I want to say something too. 2 years ago, I tried to murder a man because I was drowning in grief and anger. Today, that same man is my friend, and together we're making sure other families don't suffer like mine did." He looked at Marcus. "But it all started with a janitor who decided that doing the right thing was more important than his own safety." The crowd was surprised when 9-year-old Emma asked to speak. "My daddy always tells me that heroes don't wear capes," she said, her voice clear and strong. He says heroes are people who help others even when it's scary, even when it's hard. She looked at her father. My daddy is my hero, but not because he got shot. He's my hero because every day he gets up and tries to make the world better for other kids like me. Emma turned to the crowd. Mr. Wellington is my hero too because he could have just said thank you and walked away, but instead he decided to help lots of families. And Mr. David is my hero because even though he was really sad and angry, he chose to help people instead of hurt people. She paused, thinking. I think maybe we're all supposed to be heroes for each other. Maybe that's what being human means. The room was completely silent. Then Judge Morrison started clapping, and soon everyone was on their feet, applauding not just Emma, but the truth she had spoken. 5 years after the shooting, Marcus Thompson sat in his office at the Emma Foundation, now one of the largest patient assistance organizations in the country. His shoulder still ached sometimes, especially when it rained, but he barely noticed it anymore. Emma, now 13, was student council president at her school and volunteered at the foundation every weekend. She wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, to help families like theirs. Wellington had remarried, a nurse he met through the foundation's work. His children lived with him now, and he coached Emma's soccer team on weekends. The pharmaceutical company he once ran was now a model for ethical business practices. David Chin had remarried too, and he and his wife had adopted 2 children whose parents had died because they couldn't afford their medications. He ran the foundation's grief counseling program. Judge Morrison had retired from the bench to run a nonprofit that helped ex-convicts find jobs and housing. She often said that watching Marcus's courage had reminded her why she became a lawyer in the first place. But perhaps the most important change was one that couldn't be measured in dollars or statistics. In that small courthouse, in that moment of crisis, a single act of courage had created ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. 10 years later, Emma Thompson Wellington, she had asked Wellington to adopt her when she turned 16, making Marcus beam with pride, stood at the podium of Harvard Medical School, giving the commencement address. My father was a janitor who saved a billionaire's life, she began. But that's not why I'm here today. She looked out at the new doctors in the audience. I'm here because that single moment taught everyone involved that we have a choice every day. We can see other people as enemies, or we can see them as family we haven't met yet. In the audience, Marcus sat with Wellington, David, and Judge Morrison. They had all aged, but their friendship had only grown stronger. They met for dinner once a month, sharing stories and planning new ways to help others. My father taught me that heroism isn't about being fearless, Emma continued. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. It's about seeing someone in need and deciding that their pain matters as much as your own. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, one moment of courage can change not just one life, but thousands of lives. Emma raised her diploma. Today, I promise to carry forward the lesson my father taught me, that we are all responsible for each other, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up when someone needs you. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes, thinking about that scared young father who had once cleaned floors and wondered how he would pay for his daughter's medication. He had saved one man's life, but in return that man, and the community they had built together, had saved his. The little girl who once asked if Daddy would be home for breakfast was now Dr. Emma Thompson Wellington, and she was going to spend her life saving others. Sometimes, Marcus thought, one moment of courage really can change everything. As the ceremony ended and families celebrated around them, Marcus looked at his chosen family, Wellington, David, and Judge Morrison, and knew that the most important lesson of all had been learned, that love in the end is always stronger than hate, and that everyone deserves a second chance to be the person they want to be. The single dad who took a bullet had not just saved a life. He had started a revolution of kindness that would continue long after all of them were gone. And Emma, now a doctor ready to heal the world, was living proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from wealth or power, but from the simple decision to do what's right, even when it costs you everything.